Sometime around 100,000 years ago, among our African sapient ancestors, we observe the gradual coalescence of new cognitive abilities. What emerges out of this coalescence is something that is common to all modern humans: symbolic cognition. Some of the earliest examples of this behavior that have been uncovered are almost certainly perforated shells, which would most likely have been strung to form beads or pendants reaching as far back as 100,000 years ago. Even more tantalizing, much larger shells are found discarded, still containing the dried remnants of ochre pigment, crushed and mixed, ready for painting. The story told by these ancient paint pots is retold by a number of pieces of ochre with geometric designs scratched into the surface dating back 70,000 years at least, some almost certainly earlier, and by fragments of ostrich shells, intricately engraved, dating back to some 60,000 years ago. Perforated beads, such as shells or the teeth of carnivorous animals, would have involved great skill or difficulty or danger to acquire, and this was likely their significance. These earliest forms of symbolism were probably not yet fully symbols. They were not so much representations of something, rather they stood as a token of the labour or the cost or the risk associated with acquiring them. In this way, they functioned like a simpler form of sign than the symbol, what is often called an index. An index is, in essence, something that points to another thing not by representation, but through simple association, often causal association. The example that is usually given is smoke and fire, smoke being the index of fire. Or you could think of a fast-moving shadow on the ground, indicating a predator in the sky, or maybe a distant growl or a footprint, indicating the presence of a lion too close for comfort. For Tomlinson, this is also the kind of function that early proto-discursive gesture calls, those ancestors of music and language, would have had. They were not yet referential, semantic symbols, but simply indexical. Similarly, the earliest use of paints and other pigments was probably not involved in the creation of wholly independent symbols, but more for altering or enhancing already existing signs. Painting the face could exaggerate its expressive power, making a growl or a grimace more terrifying, or otherwise conferring power to the painted individual. Tracing over the already existing lines of the face with paint or charcoal makes them louder. Now, understanding this opens up a deep history of symbols that stretches far, far back, in which symbolism starts as something very close to repetition, the retracing of existing patterns. Even the earliest musical instruments, and it's not even really right to call them such, we should maybe use terms like sound producers or acoustic tools, should probably be thought of in a similar light. Before flutes, there would have almost certainly been all manner of vocal resonators. Conical pieces of wood or bone, either shaped by chance or human hands, so that when placed on the mouth, the voice would be amplified by them. And how far back before this humans were using their hands around their mouths to direct and amplify their voices when calling, just as we do today, would be impossible to guess. All these liminal cases raise the question of whether we are even able to always recognize early musical instruments or sound producers when we find them. After all, many people would likely not recognize a bull roarer as an instrument if they saw one lying on the floor. It's just a piece of wood tied to a rope. Little would they guess the instrument's deep history, spanning tens of thousands of years across all inhabited continents. Nor would they imagine the deep associations it has with the summoning of spirits and other higher mysteries. Or what a profound and strange sound such an instrument can produce. So starting from something that was very close to repetition, and through a gradual lengthening of the taskscape and a widening of the distance between thought and action, gradually came displaced referentiality, symbols proper, both as a way of bridging this ever-widening gap, but also as the greatest widening of this gap that had occurred up until that point. We are now dealing with fully modern humans. Humans who weren't only anatomically modern, those had been around for 150,000 years already, but humans who were culturally modern. In other words, humans whose behaviours to a large extent differ from ours in the same order that the behaviours of other humans living in other cultures around the world today differ from us. Especially when we consider the case of contemporary humans living in pre-settled societies. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's a good way of understanding how truly close these humans would have been to us. This coalescence into modernity would likely have taken place around the time of the final migrations out of Africa, some 60 to 50,000 years ago, and may even have been brought from Africa by these latest migratory waves. It is shortly after this that we begin to find an explosion of very unequivocally human activities. The earliest representational figures, the famous Lion Man sculpture, or the earliest unambiguous musical instruments, dating from around 40,000 years ago. In both cases, the design is sufficiently advanced that we cannot imagine that these were the first of their kind. Many of these finds have been unearthed in caves, and along with the famous examples of rock art and cave painting, they have created an image in the mind of the general public that prehistoric humans lived in caves. But they almost certainly did not live in caves, if by live in we mean the same kind of thing that we mean when we say that we live in a permanent dwelling like a house. Prehistoric humans were nomadic. They were a shifting, moving, migrating part of the natural landscape. The caves would likely have functioned as something closer to temporary campsites, or some other form of temporary shelter, possibly used on a seasonal basis. We know from remains that our ancestors returned to these caves over and over, in some cases over the course of thousands of years. Now, sometimes we may be dealing with different groups of humans stumbling upon the same cave, which was exploited by more than one group in a similar fashion at different times. But in other cases, we're likely dealing with the same group returning to a cave again and again, its location being handed down from one generation to the next. After all, for these ancient nomadic humans, knowledge of the land was everything. In the context of these very active and mobile lives, caves would have likely functioned as focal points, landmarks both in space and in time. The caves provided shelter for these humans, but also something more intangible, and in a sense, more profound. In Tomlinson's own words, their shelters sharpened their lifeways. The group identity crystallized in the light and heat of the fires they lit in the entryways. With this came many things, good and not. Reenactments and recountings of the day's activities. The laying of plans for subsequent days. Assertions of leadership. resulting in rivalries and fights, the furthering or fracturing of new and old liaisons, ranging from strategic alliance to sexual bonding, and often including both. Now, in these activities, and in the crystallizing of the identity of the group, the taskscapes of humans specialized. New modalities of creation flourished, artifacts whose purpose was not merely functional, but decorative or symbolic or transcendental. The more skilled makers would have worked the most precious materials, and out of these they would have fashioned items that were not simply valued for the difficulty involved in obtaining the material, or just for the skill required in making the object. They would have also held some communally understood significance. Worn around the neck, or on clothing, or fixed to a spear, they might have granted the wearer a certain status, or indicated group membership. Other artifacts would have held even deeper and stranger meanings, perhaps summoning or embodying unseen powers. Even the making of such talismans would have been in itself an act of deep magic. In these specialized taskscapes, we find a very strange new type of tools. Hollow bird bones, or a mammoth tusk split open, scraped out and reattached with adhesive, with finger holes scraped or drilled at specific intervals. These tools were not used in the gathering or preparing of food, nor were they used for hunting or to make clothing. But for those who knew how to blow into them, they could produce a dazzling array of sounds, drawing to them and controlling unseen acoustical forces. Some of these doubtless would have also been carried deep into the caves to conjure up or entreat with the mysteries that lay within. In one of the caves, the flutes found bare, enigmatic notches cut all along the length of the pipe. These markings don't seem to have been used during the construction to help locate the correct placement of the finger holes, since reconstructions show that they were cut after the holes were made. They also don't seem to really have a decorative function, as they are spaced irregularly and become more bunched up as they approach the end of the pipe, suggesting the engravers didn't know how many marks they would be making when they started out. This has led some scholars to suggest that perhaps each notch recorded a use of the instrument, possibly in a recurring practice of great significance, and each time the flute was used, another notch would be added as a primitive form of external memory storage. The flutes would likely have been carried with them as the group travelled, the oldest perhaps holding the record of many generations' use. The making of pipes with discrete finger holes is evidence that thinking of pitch in terms of discrete steps was already well established. But it also likely reinforced this cognitive process by embodying a fixed set of pitches in a physical artifact external to the mind. The pipes were also, in a sense, measuring devices. Not in the sense of measuring devices used to aid in the construction of something, the way that you might use a ruler, but in the deeper sense of probing into the nature of the world. Closer to the way in which we use telescopes or spectrometers today to measure the light emitted by a star. Not because we are going to use that measurement to build something, but because we hope to glean from it some understanding of the world of which we are part. When you blow into pipes, you find that pipes of different length produce different pitches. The cutting of pipes into different lengths in order to find and obtain new pitches is inherently an act of inquiry into the world, into the measurement and nature of acoustical phenomena. And what is more striking is that what they measured could not be seen or touched. The cutting of pipes and the boring of finger holes represents the organizing of sounds into an invisible structure, a physical object that records the forms of the immaterial world. Now, these may be the earliest examples that we have so far found of that probing into the invisible structures that we imagine to underlie the phenomena that we observe in the world, what in ancient Greek was called physis and we now call physics. Now, when in later episodes we will come to ancient China and to the ancient Greeks, we will see how in their conception of the world, music was profoundly connected to measurement, to cosmology, to the study of the universe, to mathematics, philosophy, the understanding of the invisible laws that governed reality. And we find similar instances in other cultures as well. Now, in the light of what we're discussing here, this understanding of music as a form of cosmology, of measurement of the world, should maybe be seen as a much more natural way for humans to conceive of music than we normally do. Tomlinson at one point even suggests that the union between cosmology and music is aboriginal, that it was there right from the start. The same hierarchical thinking that means that we conceive of cosmology in a hierarchical fashion, reasoning by levels of abstraction, when we say, for example, that the laws of physics are fundamental, is the same kind of thinking in nested hierarchies that was required for the emergence of musicking. Now, in this coalescing of modernity,